He wanted out, so once he's out, the door closes.
Oh, so he's an outdoor cat too, huh?
Oh, no. He wanted out of the office.
Oh, got it.
Charlie has suddenly become an only indoor dog because because it's coyote season. They've arrived on the golf courses, and not a good time for small dogs.
Yes, too many coyotes in our neighborhood to let the cat out.
Yeah,
but it's rabbit season.
Yes.
They do control the rabbit population, and there's lots of rabbits on the course. That's why.
Yeah, we have foxes that take them out.
Hey, Mitchell, this is the Amish corn big old bag or whatever.
Hold it just a little lower so I can get a better shot at it. Nice.
That's the same size one I bought, Hershey.
Yep.
I've got just about as much left as you.
And it's, well, here's the corn's in here.
Oh, I see.
Do you have a popper device that you use?
Yeah, I couldn't find it right off bat, so I didn't want to waste time looking for it. But it's the whirly pop where it folds in half, like the top half folds in half, and then you put in a cup of this. You could put ghee, which is clarified butter. You could put peanut oil, and then stir it up. It has a little knob on the back. You just spin around, and it stirs it up, and you got good old popcorn.
Anybody else had a problem with husks and gums? Just saying.
Not the gums.
Does it get under your dentures? And
I don't have dentures, but I occasionally find popcorn, the little tiny husks stuck somewhere in my dental work, and I have to go digging for them.
You can dehusk them one at a time.
Can you?
Have
Here, I'll paste the link in the Amazon into the chat.
What would you do? Like take a
6-pounder.
Take a sidewalk, like motorized sidewalk sweeper, and blow fast air.
You floss.
Oh, well, yeah. Once it's in your teeth, you can get it out. But if you're eating popcorn if you have bowls of popcorn for clients around, and you turn around and you got a big husk stuck on your tooth.
Tweezers.
Oh, okay. Go shopping for dental implements next.
Thank you, Archie. That was very instructive.
That's complete and cross check.
Copy.
You can try and take water and just swish your mouth with them.
Aha. Should I do it now?
No, wait till we go live.
Okay. I'm waiting for a big spit take.
Yeah, not going to use in a camera that's close to you.
If anything, look up Alton's recipe for it. I think it is.
Alton Brown makes popcorn.
Yeah, he has a recipe in there with these specific Amish country popcorn.
Yeah, that's where I got mine.
Yep,
it's Alton Brown,
and I got it from him. That guy named Alex.
That's also where I learned I didn't need the salt, the butter as much as I thought I did. I mean, I used to be known for dumping butter on things, so it's.
Mine without the butter. Put it on later. Butter.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Office Hours. If you're watching on YouTube, you can find out more about what we do at officehours.global. Our first hour is general discussion about digital media production of all kinds. Second hour is usually something we want to spend a little bit more time on. And today, Gary Trenda of Sound Devices is going to be talking to us about RF. It's something that we talk about a lot. and I think that we do the best we can to answer well, but this is one of the world experts in it. So we're really excited to have Gary on. If you've got questions about RF of your wireless mics, specifically audio, then make sure to jump on and get those questions into Makana early. I have a feeling it'll be pretty busy today. All right, let's go ahead and jump into the questions. Bill, what do we have?
First one comes from TJ Asher in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And TJ asks, over the last several years, I've heard people in office hours with a, quote, shotgun mic, and some sound really good and some sound just plain awful and roomy. What could cause the difference?
Go ahead, Guy.
Yeah, it's really about the proximity and the chain. So it's the mic capsule, as well as the preamp. So if you have a noisy preamp, that could creep into the chain. But also a lot of people think that because they get one of these shotgun mics that it's going to sound great, even if it's like they see in the movies 2 feet away. But a lot of those sound stages are completely quiet with the room treated. So a shotgun mic for indoors isn't really the best mic. A hypercardioid would, like the Shep CMC 641, would be what you'd see on a set. The interference tube design also, if you're near these interior walls will bounce the sound a little bit late, which can cause like a warbling sound. So shotguns really aren't meant to be indoors, but really there's a video I put up in the Mukana chat that demonstrates a fan in a room where we actually rotate it, because these things have a tail too. So as you compress the sound down, the pickup pattern, unlike other microphones, it might be like a cardioid or an Omni, where they have different patterns, like a cardioid will pick up from one side, which this is a super cardioid pattern, which is picking up just directly in front of it, but it develops this tail, which a lot of people think, oh, turn it to the rear and you're going to reject the sound. Well, you're actually picking up that tail. And I have another video on YouTube that I'll put a link in, where you really hear that tail pronounced as we rotate the mic around on a jib.
Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, one of the things, I think that's one of the worst names we've had at shotgun mic, because it presumes that it's going to reach out like a shotgun pattern and grab something only in front of it, not to the sides. And none of them work exactly like that. In fact, they're frequency dependent. They tend to be directional at upper, mid, and high frequencies. They're not directional at low frequencies. So if your room is not treated and you've got a lot of echo bouncing around, that's still going to hit the element of the mic and it's still going to be recorded. So you really have to understand what the pattern does and how the room affects that to get rid of that boominess.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, it's been covered mostly. Yeah, if your room is reflective, it's bad to use a shotgun mic, because it achieves its directionality by the interference tube, which is the long tube with the slots cut down the side of it. And it counts on the fact that sound is arriving at 90 degrees, and if it's to achieve its directionality, and if it's reflecting off the wall and coming in at a different angle, it messes up its tunedness, and it doesn't filter out a lot of the reflections. So the reflections can get in through the side vents, and it creates a roomier sound than it should, than a non-shotgun microphone or an omnidirectional microphone or a cardioid microphone placed closer to the person.
Mitchell?
Yeah, shotgun is also a little bit of a misnomer, but you would think that it, again, like you were just said earlier, that it's something that has this magic ability to pull sound in real close. What's interesting is some years ago, Ernie Anderson, a very popular voiceover guy, used to do the Love Boat and stuff like that, started using a Sennheiser 416 as a close-up voiceover microphone, and you wouldn't think that a shotgun can do that. But look at Bill. Bill right there is with that aforementioned Sennheiser 416, and it sounds just like my close talk 414 right in front of me. So shotgun isn't magical in terms of where it works. If you can work it close, especially if it's that 416, and it'll sound just like a regular cardioid microphone.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, I was going to mention my 415s were working in Buzzy's recording studio for about 20 years now, and they do work great in a recording studio or in a quiet room like Bill has it there, and you get it close to you. So they have been used as voiceover microphones quite a bit in the industry. A lot of commercials and stuff are done at 416.
Next question.
Next one comes from Bo Cordell in Charleston, South Carolina. And Bo says, ESPN recently pulled off a basketball game broadcast using a complete cloud-based end-to-end workflow. Does anyone have experience with the Simply Live suite of tools they used? And he's got a link there to them.
Go ahead, Guy.
I looked at it a few years ago. It seemed expensive for what it was, but they recently were picked up just a few months ago. They announced at IBC that Riedel bought them, and I saw this article hit LinkedIn. Bo must have seen it as well. And so in the article, they talk about the end-to-end cloud. Actually, let me pop the right thing into preview program. There we go. So the slick thing about it is that on site, you can have replay, and you can have audio mixing, and then from afar, you can add commentary, graphics, and you can have replay operators at home. The trick is this thing called the venue gateway, and the venue gateway is what allows you to have that hardware transcoding in either H.264 or H.265, either via SRT or Zixi, or using a Nimbra Edge. One of these transport, depending on the security and the redundancy that you need, it's the hardware that allows that physical cable to go in and then shoot it up to the cloud. And in the article, they talk about using AWS, and they also talk about using Sienna processing engine. I believe that's for some kind of NDI conversion. I want to dig a little bit more into it because my job, I want to break this stuff down and see. So these things are going to be, $20,000, $30,000. So I try to say, how can we do this for cheaper? So Tucker and a couple of us have this little side group where we talk about things like this. So that's one of the things that we've been discussing this morning is like, how can we do this cheaper? So, we do it with vMix and with Zoom, and there's a couple things that we pull off that are similar using hardware from Epiphan with the Nanos. That's how we get our SRT streams in. So it's just a matter of how do you want to suck your commentary, your replay. That's where these guys are winning, though, is the replay hardware. So that's, I think, the interest from Riedel is that replayability for multiple angles from afar.
Next question.
Cherry Cheetah in Dallas, Texas says, we're doing a hybrid event where we want to populate a real-time map with people's locations based on a form submission. Has anyone found any tools to accomplish this?
Go ahead, Mitchell.
You've probably heard us talk a lot about the Tlaloc traversal at the end of the show. Part of the system is a globe that rotates to show where each of these questions are coming from. So I know we've done it, and I recall that he'd used Isadora to program an HTML globe that rotated to stop for each person's geographic coordinates.
Yeah, go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, you might look into Google Earth because they have a commercial product called Google Earth Studio that lets you do animations and rotate to specific points and zoom in. It's what most of the networks use when they do when they go to a location of a news event somewhere and show the globe rotating and zooming in on a specific area. It's available to broadcasters, and I'm not sure what the cost is, but there is a cost.
Yeah, and I think that I think that what ours is doing, someone should probably jump into the chat, is getting the longitude and latitude and being able to find it on a globe, because ours isn't really based on Google Earth. But I do agree with Courtney. Google Earth, if you're trying to animate a globe to it, the easiest way to do that would probably be Google Earth. There are other companies, if you're looking for just building a map that shows everybody that's at the event, and we've done this in the past, both with memberships and maps, and even what I'm just trying to visualize. I had about 1,500 venues. I had to figure out where they all were in the world, and I had to just see it. And I was looking for a map tool to do this, so I could just see it across the globe. There's a couple companies that do a fair bit of this: Mapdiv, Mapline, BatchGeo. These are all online tools that will let you build those out. They have different cost structures and privacy structures. The one that I ended up using, and the one that I've used on and off for the last 20 years for mapping, is the Google Maps API. So the API is very powerful. There are easy ways to just dump a bunch of, just literally push a CSV into it. It'll just show a bunch of stuff, but you can customize all the things that are in there via the API. So if you want to visualize that, that's probably the place I would start. And then I would also look again at Mapdiv, Mapline, BatchGeo, see if they have tools that you may want, again, as a wide map. If you want to animate it to it, I'd probably use Google Earth as well. Next question.
Andy Korkendorfer in Vieira, Florida is up next. Thoughts about using the CalDigit TS4 on an M2 Mac Pro for live Zoom and or video switching? Thanks.
Yeah, I have not had a lot of great experiences with CalDigit, related to Zoom specifically. So it's not that I've had actually maybe the earlier version of what you're talking about. and I've bought them, and they've worked fairly well. But with Zoom and with some of the switchers and audio, I've had some breakup, and I think I'm not the only one that has had some irregularities using the cow digits when they get when they get a little too much data going through them. I would probably recommend looking at OWC. They make things that are very similar, and we've had a lot less anomalies. Next question.
Next question comes from Clive Kirchner in Souk, British Columbia. How do you deal with the dust in the rat's nest of wires and cables, either behind your monitors or on the floor? Any special DIY vacuum adapters? Kids' chores for allowance? Wear a mask and carry on? Hire help and leave the house?
Yeah, go, Tom.
Well, I live in Phoenix, so I know about dust. I use a Dyson stick vacuum. That gets out most of the large dust bunnies. When dusting around the equipment, I use microfiber cloths. Never, ever use compressed air. And for a final touch-up, I can always build up a static charge on Merlin and run him past underneath.
Go ahead. Hardsheet.
Well, for dust in general, I do have a electric duster that I use, so I know that the dust will get around. It's called EXPOR, I think, on Amazon. But if you type in electric dusters, I just looked it up, and there are a few that have a compressed air kind of thing and a vacuum, so kind of a 3-in-1 setup. This usually works really well for keyboard cleaning or anything like that. So if you have a specific little area and you want to just put like newspaper down on the floor and then just dust your little area off, the only thing you got left to do would be vacuum around your floor, and it'll pick it all up. And there's two speeds on it.
Hey, go ahead, Bill.
This is a little expensive, but it's what I did. I had a circumstance once where there was a complex thing. It wasn't wires, but it was similar, and it had a lot of dust on it. And so I used a 2-stage system. I took my shop vac and I put it on the side, put it on high, and had a vacuum there. Mm-hmm. And then I took a compressed air trigger thing and blew off some of the dust. If you just use compressed air, all you're going to do is aerosolize all the dust into your environment. But if you put a negative pressure vacuum at the same time, you can get most of that out after you knock it off whatever it's in. So that's the process I used.
There you go, Jeffrey, real quick.
The smaller the nozzle, the better, of course. And but a little trick: if you have something high powered that you need to vacuum with, you can take a piece of pantyhose and then you kind of wedge it in between the nozzle that you're using and the hose itself, and that way, when the cord comes up, it's not going to suck all the way into the vacuum.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, for the dusty rat's nest, I use dust-eating rats because they work very good. And failing that, I do use a leaf blower and put on my COVID mask, blow it all out from behind there, and then vacuum the room after that.
Next question.
Next question comes from Chad Lafarge in Columbia, Missouri. Macworld is reporting that devices with M2 are using a single NAND chip in SSD versus 2 for the M1, slowing performance by up to 50%. Have you seen that performance drop? And it's got a link there to the article noting this.
Yeah, I just bought. I mean, literally, I have a box over here that's the new M2 that's there. That and it's got 256. I didn't do anything special to it. I just wanted something that acts as glue. If you're buying a 256 gig, I would argue that you're probably not expecting it to have really fast drive speed. I mean, these drive speeds are already pretty fast as it is. At 256, I'm only going to be able to put system architect, basically the apps on the computer, and that's all I need for what I'm doing with this M2. That's all I need. So I think that that's what Apple assumed, is that you're probably not doing high performance work if you're getting a 256 gig drive, and so I think you're probably it is there, but I don't think that most people are going to notice, because that's not how the person who buys the M2 256 is using the Mac Mini. And if they do use it that way, then they might be misguided. Next question.
Next one comes to us again from Andy Kokendorfer in Vieira, Florida. Client wants glass panels for light transmission, but this creates a sound reflective surface. Is there such a thing as sound treated glass?
Good, Courtney.
Not for reflectivity. For sound transmission, there's dual pane glass, or you could put up 2 panes of glass to isolate the sound from one room into the other. But it's still going to be reflective if you can see through it. So, because if you treat the surface of it, one thing you can do is mount it at an angle. So make sure it's not perfectly parallel to the opposing walls. Or if you have 2 glass walls, make sure they're not perfectly parallel. Tilt one of them down a little bit, or tilt both of them down a little bit, or one down and one up. to achieve to get rid of the standing wave between the two of them.
In a larger room, I saw there's a slightly thicker matte surface that can be put on the windows. It definitely cuts down on the transmission. It doesn't look like you can look through the windows, but if you're looking for light, there's a surface that's kind of, again, it's like that matte finish, but it's thick. And it's, like velvety kind of thick. And we've seen these put on event windows, and they don't really pick up any kind of the low end reflection and they still are a little problematic, but they take out a lot of the really high end, kind of reflection from the windows. It made a much bigger difference than I expected. Like to put that on there. Again, it's only if you're using those windows for transmission, because it is kind of like an opal once they're put on. It's there to let that light in. It also creates some privacy. So there's a couple different things that they do. So you might want to look for that as well. Next question.
TJ Asher, Minneapolis. My ATEM software control suddenly no longer sees my ATEM Mini Pro. It worked a couple of weeks ago. No OS updates since then. Static IP on the ATEM and connected to the network. Setup app sees it. Software version is 8.9. The Mac OS version is 12.6.2. Any ideas?
Go, Jeffrey.
I see this problem a lot when you're switching networks. I know this is not the case, but it's if your IPs are changing at all, then the software kind of gets hung up on there. And I would turn off on your Mac, I'd turn off the wireless so you only have one source coming in, and also check your Ethernet cables, because I've had a bad Ethernet cable cause this problem as well.
Yeah, and I would also be curious as to whether it works when you connect it over a USB. So if you connect it over USB-C, does it show up? And if it does, then obviously there's something going on with the way the network works. But I'd be curious. The first thing I would do is do it. I have had an issue where my ATEM Mini Pro would not connect over the Ethernet. I plugged it into USB-C, saw it, ran it, and then unplugged the USB-C again, plugged in the Ethernet, and it worked fine. Like there was some kind of, handshake thing that wasn't going on. So you may want to try to do a direct connect and see if that works. Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, if you have a switch in between the two and you're only using Ethernet to connect the two and you're not using USB, make sure your switch hasn't rebooted or something, because it can lose its routing, especially if it has a static IP address. It can lose its routing table, and so check that. You might have to reboot your switcher if it's got a switch in between the.
And something else could be using that IP as well. And you could just let it sit on DHCP. On the same network, the ATEM doesn't need you to know what the IP is. It'll find every other ATEM on the network without in that little connect list. So you might want to just set in the setup, because the setup can see it. Go ahead and set it to DHCP and let it roam, and then see if you can see it as well. Next question.
Andy Kokendorfer's back from Vieira, Florida. Has anyone watched the Tony Robbins event? If so, any interesting techniques or tech in use?
Good guy.
Yeah, I tuned into a little bit of it yesterday. It looks like the same kind of setup that they had previously, which is Tony's home in Florida, which this monster TV is probably a 90-inch or something crazy like that. They've got a UE150, two UE150s. You could see them here in front. And so when he's looking at the camera, he's actually looking out of this 9-up. So this is probably a decimator that's creating this 9-up multi-view out of one large monitor. So UE150 here, UE150 here, script or prompter essentially down the middle, chat off to the right side here. And then just throughout the thing, he's looking into it. He's watching the people in Zoom. He's looking at the chat. He's able to call out people. They're able to take those people full screen. So there's, an operator. He's pointing at people. He's got, the ability to have the back end crew take any of those people that he wants, because they've labeled these breakout rooms, and they're able to assign those and pull them up. And then standard issue 2-up boxes with PowerPoint, and he just goes through his spiel. And I put a link in the chat to this unfortunately is the Spanish version that he left up on YouTube, but I have another one. If you DM me, I can get you the US version.
And that's and what's the model? Is it he's charging for that, right?
This one's completely free.
Oh, interesting. Very interesting. And do you know how many people attended?
He says up to 1 million, so I don't know if that's true, but that's the numbers that he's reporting.
Wow, that's super interesting. And it's super interesting that he did it for up to 1 million without anybody in the audience. Very interesting. So anyway, yeah. Go ahead, Courtney.
Are there operators on those PTCs, Guy, or they just set it to track his teeth?
I'm sure there's a big crew. Yeah, I'm sure there's a big crew behind in that. From the previous one that I saw, there was a massive crew on this. It's not just a little thing; it's a massive crew. Even in his home, it's 20 people there, so it's not a little thing. And then there's, of course, people like Grant or somebody like him managing those breakout rooms and spooling them all up. And because they feed it into multiple. I believe it's Max and then a constellation, and they're able to pull any of those rooms and any of those people. So they'll say like room 22, pull Julie, and then they'll take Julie full screen, and now that's decimated, and they can suck it into the constellation and pull off that super source.
Yeah, it's the future. We all talked about the fact that we were going to start seeing shows with 1 million people. I just didn't expect it to happen quite so quickly. So, but we'll see if he actually got to that. It's a great funnel though of creating something that's free, that's going to just go out to everyone. And then of course there'll be new courses that are $300 or $500 or whatever that you can do over Zoom that are more private. It's interesting. I'd be interesting to think of the thought process there because I know that he was doing things that were really big on these big circular pieces, and then he went to kind of some weird hybrid, and now he's doing it at his home. So it's an interesting progression of that process. Next question.
Jack Ruppel in Breckenridge, Colorado says using Apple's spatial audio is it possible to provide separate audio feeds depending on head positioning, i.e. French, German, English, diegetic, non-diegetic, and leitmotif, commentary, director, sound designer, director of photography?
I don't know if I fully understand the head positioning. So there's some tracking that already exists inside of the headset. So if you have the spatial on and you have the head tracking on and you have an Apple headset of some kind, if you move, you're gonna hear it. It's gonna stay stationary to where you're at, which actually kind of drives me crazy. So I don't actually like that feature at all. Like I thought I did, and I used to use it when I tested because I did a lot of HDR stuff or HDR and spatial. So I would go like this, and I would know it was activated by swinging my head around. So that helped, but I don't really enjoy that much. Now I don't know how the languaging. Whether you could turn one way or the other. One thing that a bunch of us are talking about right now, and we're going to be doing some testing in the spring, is using the surround. So in a mostly talky, so we can give you, deliver, of course, Atmos to your, and what Atmos means mostly when you're delivering to a live event is you're going to deliver a bunch of channels. You're not really delivering true Atmos because the pipelines for Atmos and Vision are pretty difficult to manage inside of a standard pipeline to go through it. So you're delivering raw channels, and that can be, 5 channels, but typically we would deliver 16 channels to the, or maybe 16, maybe 12 or 10, but we'll deliver those channels to it. The encoder then, typically an elemental encoder, will take those channels and then reconvert them to an Atmos space and define them as Atmos. They has to tag them as Atmos. Then when it comes out the other end, you have those channels where they needed to be. In that area, what you want to do is what we're looking at doing is when you're doing a talk, someone just talking to you like Tony Robbins, they're coming through the center channel. Like you're not sending them through stereo. You're not having them jump around typically. We've been playing with the idea of putting translations in the 1 or 2 translations or other information in the surrounds, because we're like, we got this idea because I was doing something where someone has to lean over and translate for the guest or for the host all the time, or the primary host. And I kind of was like, well, someone just kind of whispering in your ear, what could we recreate that, to the side? And so that's one of the ways we might be able to use that surround to add other languages to that model. And what's nice about that is you get to hear the person, you get to hear the expression that they have, but then you also get to hear what they said without having to look at text. So I think it could be an interesting thing. Go ahead, Courtney.
An interesting adjunct to what you described there, Alex, would be to program the other way, too, to use it for comms for people that aren't on camera, so that you could hear, like, the audio guy is off to the left and the TD is off to the right, so you could say, hey, Mickey, turn it up a little bit. Hey, Chad, ready for camera 2. And so you could turn left and right without having to operate individual comm controls to talk to individual people. So you could key the transmission to the head position.
Yeah, because I know that a lot of folks, a lot of engineers, when I say a lot, Brian Maddox, I work with him a lot. I know Brian pans a lot of the stuff that he does in his headphones so that he knows who's clients and who's not. And it's not quite as advanced as what you're talking about, but it really helps him figure out knowing where things are, who is who based on their position in his headset. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, I was thinking exactly like Courtney was, and it seemed odd to me to be able to go, the tech director I talked to over here and the actual director I talked to over here. But I would think if I'm talking to the director and a sound comes over there and I move over, it might cut off speech. I think it would be something you have to get used to, but it's an interesting concept, switching by body position.
Yeah. Next question.
Next one comes to us from David Brady in New York City. He says, dug up a Blackmagic Drive Ultra Studio 4K Extreme, but it appears to be bricked. The display simply flickers. Is it worth trying to revive, or should I e-waste it?
Go ahead, Mitchell.
Of course, it's worth trying to revive. There's some things you can do that are simple, some things you do that are complicated. But the simplest thing is to hit the reset button that takes it back to factory defaults. And I think there's a button combination. I know that my Mini Extreme can do that. The other is to try to reinstall the ROM software, which is basically a firmware update, and see if that affects it. And the third thing you can do is just mail it to me.
He'll work on it for you. Mitchell can be your e-waste provider, and then you can just send it to him, and he'll bang on it and see what happens. Yeah. Flashing the firmware or trying to update it might be one way to see if it comes back. In general, that kind of thing is going to be old enough that it probably isn't worth trying to update it. It'll probably cost more than just replacing it. Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, one thing, if it's flickering, you might want to check the frequency of the crystal that is on. It's driving everything in there. It could be it got knocked or is off frequency or broken. So check that, and that might be your solution.
And my major use of eBay, by the way, is getting rid of e-waste, because there's a lot of people that will buy something that you tell them flat out it doesn't work, but you make it $25 or $10 or $15, and you'd be surprised at how many, plus shipping or whatever. You'd be surprised how many people just go, yes, I'll take that, and they feel more optimistic than I do about fixing it. Next question.
Paul Wallace, Austin, Texas, says, is Blackmagic DaVinci Editor good at rendering all formats? How does it compare in this department to other editors?
Go ahead, Mitchell.
Wow, they kind of range the whole gamut. I mean, Avid's probably the worst. Blackmagic might be second, and then you get Premiere and Final Cut. Most of the stuff will do a mezzanine format, which is a good place to be rendering to, because then you don't have to worry down the road. So if you're talking about rendering the output, do it to a mezzanine format like ProRes, and then you can use compressor or media edit to encoder, to create whatever the client wants it ultimately set out in.
Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, sadly, nothing does everything. I do a lot of broadcast delivery, and when I have to do that, there are a couple of stations that are really difficult, and I've had to roll my own specific encoding things using a couple of tools to get things out to those station specs. It depends on what they've licensed, what the company manufacturing their software has licensed to put inside their programs, because most of those codecs are controlled by third parties.
I only export out of Resolve at the highest resolution that I think is worth having. So it's HQ or something else that's potentially higher than that, and then I use compressor to turn it into any other formats that I want. I don't try to, and I do the same thing with Final Cut.
You're talking ProRes, right?
Well, or anything that I want to output. I mean, generally, I would say 99% of the time, my clients want to be delivered footage in ProRes, so like that is the most standard. We hear DNX every once in a while, but like literally once a year, and then outside of that, it's ProRes that they want delivered. So I export it out of my editor, whatever editor I'm using. I export at the highest resolution. Then I use a compressor to make it, to break it out into all the other versions that I want to do it in. That way, also, if the compression crashes, I already have the original, and it's much faster to do that than to go back and pull the edit out. So I would highly recommend not using the editor to compress if you don't have to. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, I was going to say most of the time the broadcasters are all pretty easy. I have 2 or 3 settings for them, and one of them usually works. It's the OTT deliveries over the top. Like if you're sending out to Hulu or something like that, you can get into the weeds in some very specific things. I agree with Alex. 99% of the time, compressor will take care of it. Although on some of them, I have to output a format and then just change the extension from MP4 or from M4V to MP4 so that their machines will understand it on that side. It is still a little bit of a goofy black art delivery.
Yeah, you can, for some of those special formats, usually they're not very high quality formats if you have to specialize it. So things like Handbrake can fix that. Handbrake's basically a graphical interface for FFmpeg. so which you can also just script. You can literally just draw, just type out a command that has all the data that you need in FFmpeg in a command line, and then just push it through that way as well. Next question.
Jack Ruppel, again from Breckenridge, Colorado. Anybody on the panel have audio experience with acoustic emissions? I'm interested in embedding After Effects audio data into a USDZ file to visualize the Avalanche Pro.
Yeah, I don't think I have a lot of reference to a lot of the, like the USDZ I recognize. Avalanche Pro I haven't used, and acoustic emissions. I'm assuming that when you're talking about, I don't.
Yeah, I might have read that wrong. I think I said After Effects audio data, but I wonder if it's AES audio data or something like that.
I think acoustic emissions audio data.
Oh, okay.
Into a USDZ file to visualize the Avalanche Pro. And I think that there's just a bunch of connections there. I'd love to find out more about what Jack's trying to solve, because I have a feeling it's really cool. I don't know. I have a feeling it has to do with avalanches.
Jack, come to After Hours.
Talk Well, or just ask us some more questions. I think that I'm really interested to understand what you're trying to do there. Please ask more questions, or jump into After Hours, or just ask more questions here. We'd love to find out more about what you're doing. It looks really interesting, especially because you're in Breckenridge. I'm assuming that it's avalanches and snow, so I think that'd be cool. All right, next question.
Scott Mueller, Germantown, New York. My Dante periodically goes silent and then comes back 30 seconds later, occasionally, using DVS on several computers with an X32. Where should I look to resolve the issue?
Good, Courtney.
You might look and see if you have a switch in the line in your network there, if they're not all on the same router, if you have a switch involved. They always recommend that you use a gigabit or better switch. It's managed switch with non-blocking, and make sure that you have disabled the energy efficient Ethernet or EEE, which tends to shut down portions or legs of the Ethernet to save power. You want to make sure that's all turned off. It sounds like a timing issue, but since you have an X32 with a Dante card in it, I assume it's providing the sync to the virtual sound cards. So I'd look into your Ethernet switch, or if you have anything on the Ethernet that is a switch that's routing things, that may be where your problem exists.
Good, Mitchell.
Yeah, I agree with what Courtney said there. The only thing is that last I heard, Dante will not work on a switch over a 1 gigabyte switch, like a 10 gig switch. It's not going to work. A dedicated switch for the Dante is recommended. And if you're having occasional problems like that, try changing the leader, which is the main sync, to a different device, and see if it acts any better.
99% chance it's the eco setting inside the switch. The eco settings are the first thing you do. Even if I don't even know how I'm going to use the Dante network, the first thing I do when I get a switch is to go into the controls. If there is any kind of managed switch or managed router, I go into the controls and I just turn off all the eco settings. Eco settings make a lot of sense if you're a large corporation and you have thousands of these and you want it to, go up and down. So it's not that there shouldn't be eco settings in the switches. I just think that they should be turned off, by default, and I turn them off by default. So I will go into that switch and turn them off almost immediately. As soon as I buy one, if it has any kind of management, I turn it off to make sure that if I ever decide to use Dante with it, I don't have dropouts. But that's something that's been a problem for a long time. Next question.
Mitchell Patria in Poland says, is there a device inventory tool using the phone camera? I'm thinking about QR codes on, for example, the cameras that could be scanned. And in this way, before you leave an event, you scan them, and then you get a list of equipment that leaves the warehouse.
So I don't know. There are some products. Most of the inventory products are pretty expensive. We use FileMaker. when I was in, so we actually built a FileMaker database of all of our equipment when I had a big house full of stuff, and we put exactly what you're talking about. We put QR codes on it just to make sure that someone, if you're having trouble. Back then, the phones weren't great at QR codes when we built it. So, but yeah, FileMaker is what we use to manage that. But there are some larger rental inventory is what you're really looking for. Those are the companies that rental inventory systems are going to be that. They're usually pretty pricey because they're kind of specialized. If you don't want to build your own in FileMaker, go ahead, Bill.
+1 on FileMaker. That's what I would use too. It's going to take a little bit of time to develop the application because catching the QR code and turning it into some sort of data is easy. All the phones do it now, but taking that data and having it drive an inventory system on the back end is going to require some programming and linking. And it's not that hard, but you have to do it. FileMaker is a good source for that.
Next question.
Cami Weinsvig in Redondo Beach says, I'm looking for a tool that can take an image and pre-generate a set of images at various sizes and or resolutions, and ideally aspect ratios for use on responsive websites.
Go ahead, Mitchell.
Photoshop is the king of image manipulation, and you could probably create a macro to do the different versions you might need from one file.
Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
I used to do that with Automator on the Mac. Now, Automator is kind of sort of deprecated-ish, and I say that because it was a serious tool for a long time. The guy, Sal, who kind of headed that, left Apple maybe a decade ago. It still functions, but I think a lot of that is going into shortcuts. So there may be a way in shortcuts to create something that will take one image and turn it into a set of image. You might want to explore that.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. Adobe makes a product specifically for preparing web graphics. I think it's called Image Ready. I don't know if they still make it, but you might look into that. It's designed to use web-safe colors and resize and rechange aspect ratio and crop them, prepare them to make a most efficient JPEG that you can put on the web or PNG.
And to date myself, what you really need is Equilibrium's debabbilizer. Everybody that laughed remembers debabbilizer. We use debabbilizer for this kind of thing all the time. But yeah, I think that Photoshop could probably do it for you. Next question.
Next one comes from Chris Widener in Lafayette, Indiana. Chris says, has anyone used the LaserCube Wi-Fi by Wicked Lasers for use with building displays instead of gobos? They're a new 7.5 watt fixture, I guess. Looks interesting.
It looks cool. I mean, I want to know more, but I haven't used it. I don't think anybody here has used them, but they are a little pricey, $2,200 to $3,000. So they do have, I would expect a lot of performance out of that. Go ahead, Mitchell.
Yeah, I don't have experience with it, but 7.5 watts in the laser world is a lot of power.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, it looks like a cool little thing to check out. Next question.
David Brady in New York City up again and trying to leverage the Shox open comms and route those via loopback, pairing to the Mac in stereo. But when I bring it into loopback, the patch, it only presents the left channel. Any thoughts as to why?
I think that I would try to make sure. I guess the question is that, well, I need to go get Tom.
If you're talking about the microphone, yeah, it's only a left channel, and you can then split it out and loop back and make it mono.
Yeah, because I'm not sure if you're trying to send it back to yourself as stereo. I'm assuming that what you're trying to do is get it back to yourself as stereo. So you have other things that you're trying to send to it in stereo, and it's only giving you the left channel. I would assume that. Otherwise, Tom's right. If it's a microphone, it's only one mic. I'm trying to figure that out. Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
Well, couldn't you take the single left channel coming into loopback and then just loop back it to a right and a left for an output if you want to solve it?
I think the intention is to hear stereo, to actually hear stereo.
So you got a mono source. Yeah, you can fake stereo.
So you want a stereo source going back to the stereo. So it sounds like it's only presenting it for the ears, I would assume, making it only available. Because if it's the mic, then we know why, because there's only one mic. Yeah, it's an interesting problem. I'd have to visualize. I have them here. I just haven't. I don't have time to put them together. We'll take a look at that. Now, next question.
Next question comes to us from Kenny Hampton in Greenville, Illinois. Many film releases to TV and made-for-streaming movie series appear dark when sent to a modern flat panel display. Night and indoor scenes are often dark with little visible detail. Why? And do the creators plan for consumer TVs when editing?
Good, Mitchell.
Well, when they output a film, they're dealing with a wide gamut of different types of monitors, whether they're OLED, micro LED, or crystal LED. There's so many different flavors out there. For the most part, I think that they push the blacks a little bit just because it looks better, and especially in a consumer situation. Rec 709 would be the standard, or 2020, provided the monitor is also set up with that. Then you would have a translation, but it's all over the place.
Good, Courtney. Oh, can't hear you.
Sorry, I was typing and my mouse was in another universe. Yeah, modern day TVs, check the setting that your TV is in, because modern day TVs, I know in my new Samsung QLED, there are like 7 different modes you can put it in, if not more. And some of them are designed for HDR, some of them are optimized, will change the frame rate, will interpolate, and others will change the contrast ratio, which is probably what you're running into to give you those really bright local dimming modes. And that can reduce the contrast and you lose detail in the shadows. Or you can put it in filmmaker mode. Look and see if your TV has a filmmaker mode or a film mode, 24 frame mode. And a lot of times that will remove all of the digital manipulation that the monitor is doing to the signal and get you strictly what the filmmaker wanted its image to look like on your TV monitor.
Yeah, and most TVs made in the last couple of years will allow you to go into either cinematic mode or filmmaker mode, and that usually you're going to find is much lower contrast and it kind of does less to the image. Dynamic, standard, gaming, all those ones tend to basically take your image and squash it, or stretch it out, and that blows out all your blacks. So that definitely is something to take a look at. Next question.
Scott Mueller in Germantown, New York, up next. What do I need to create a VPN between 2 remote computers to use Companion remotely without interfering with the general internet at the venue?
Well, you're going to interfere with it some because you're using some of the bandwidth, but I think that those kind of VPNs, and I don't know, Guy, do you know if the Companion will it work over VPN? It will.
Yeah, so you need a Jonas is what you need. He offers consulting services. Tucker, they use OpenVPN, I believe. It's a fee-based system, and then you set it up. But we use AWS, and so he set them up for me so that my Stream Deck just basically talks to our instances. But it was through OpenVPN. You could probably do it yourself if you can figure it out. But when he was setting it up, he was trying to explain it to me, and it was over my head. So it's pretty deep stuff.
Yeah, my expensive but turnkey solution is Meraki's, because they're expensive because you're paying a membership for them and you're paying for them. So I'm not going to say that they're the cheap solution, but they just kind of work. And so we've been using them for over a decade. Go ahead, Jeffrey.
The only thing that I'll add to that is that you might want to, of course, definitely check with the venue, make sure that they haven't tied it down so you can or cannot use VPN in certain situations.
Yeah, you got some click in there. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael's up next. He says the modeling in the Quarterbacks Tonight shot was incredible. How would they build the composition, and how would they tailor the lighting and or textures? Would it all be done in the Unreal Engine editor?
Yeah, so I think that for the most part, that's all built in, it's probably built in, I think we talked about it yesterday, but Cinema 4D. And then, there's most likely motion capture going to the characters. There's probably not much interactive lighting with the stadium. I'm sure they made it just kind of look as nice as it could. If they really wanted to get into it, they might take a spherical of the stadium, or a spherical, you could even literally, if you wanted to use it, I don't think that they did this, but if I wanted to do that, I would probably run out during halftime and take a theta shot. You'd get all the lights and everything else, and then you could just map it back on as a reflection map. So that would be a way to kind of grab onto it and make it feel a little bit more like it's there. But I don't think that they did any of those things. I think they just made it look relatively good in the test plates. So I don't think that there was the lighting. I'm sure the lighting was a lot of it was kind of finished in Unreal or whatever the platform is that they're using there, probably some variant of Unreal. To make that actually work, and so so I think that's most likely, but I don't think there's a lot of interactive lighting that's actually interacting with the background that's there. Next question.
Next question. Eric Billings in Washington, D.C. is curious about the big fire in the chip factory. Has the panel been following the DAC recovery process from the AKM fire? Are new chips being produced, or are platforms being redesigned for older existing chips?
Go ahead, Mitchell.
Eric, I think your last supposition is correct. I think a lot of devices have been redesigned based on the availability of digital audio chips and such. The other thing is that they're busy building those factories, and even here in the United States, I think legislation was just passed to allow this type of construction to happen here. But we're years and years away from being able to supply that. So in the meantime, what are people doing? I think you already answered your own question there. Yeah,
most people are trying to design around it, but we've just heard there's a rumor that we'll never see any more QL1s, that they are there's that they're not, that they're end of lifing it because they just can't redesign that to make that actually work. So it's a pretty problematic thing that's happened there. I do think that a lot of things that happened over COVID, and this is not a COVID issue, this was a fire issue, has really had people rethink the global pipeline, because we've had this issue before. The reason the reason SR tapes disappeared, from the market, this is the Sony SR tapes, is because both tape manufacturing machines for 1 week are in the same place at the same time. And when the earthquake in Japan hit, it killed both of them, and the expense of reproducing it near the end of their life anyway just had everything just disappear. And what happened was, it wasn't there. Everyone was panicking. They went paying incredible amounts. An SR tape would typically cost like $100, and they were paying $1,000, $1,500. I was digging through trying to find my SR tapes to do that. But then they all moved to solid state and everything else around it, because it was a real issue. And so these kind of things happen. We've seen that happen with floods in the area where they make all the hard drives. So even though it's global, it's not really distributed, because the capital investment required to build a factory is so high. If someone's already doing it very efficiently and it's commoditized, it's very hard to competitively invest hundreds of millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars into a factory when you're only going to make 5% on every piece. Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, they have AKM has resumed production, but they've are producing under the Velvet Sound moniker now, and they may have changed the chip packaging. So if that's the case, then if you've got older designs with board layouts that to work with the old chip packaging, it may not work with the new one. So they will have to do a board redesign. But they are shipping again, DACs from AKM. So the pipeline will be full again, but it may be with a different chip.
Which is a massive issue for people manufacturing hardware. Go ahead, Guy.
Yeah, I will say that I was surprised the other day to see the MixPre 3s that we had ordered almost a year ago just came into stock. So we have 10 of those. So that tells me that they got them from there, because that was one of the big holdups. So we have 10, well, less than 10 now once we filled some of the back orders. But yeah, they're shipping.
They'll be all gone by the end of the week. Now the guy said it here.
Hurry, folks.
Yeah, exactly. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael's up next. The Tony Robbins setup looks very interesting. Could you conceivably use NDI or use an NDI Zoom ISO and vMix approach to take the Constellation out of the loop at that scale?
I think it'd be pretty hard, actually. We're talking about an immense amount of signals and bandwidth. This is where copper seems inefficient, but it actually is moving a lot of content relatively easily. I don't think that NDI would be the right solution, for this. And when you're putting out tons and tons of outputs, NDI is not as efficient as SDI to take it out of the nodes. And so I don't think that they would replace this right now. Of course, there's a lot going on in the cloud to make all of that stuff work and to build all these rooms. And so, but there's probably some NDI in that environment, But once you need to supply, tens or hundreds of signals, the baseband copper is pretty useful. Next question.
Edwin R. Ruiz in Chicago was wondering if it's possible to connect two Stream Decks remotely using the native software, perhaps using Parsec to connect both computers.
I think it would. I think we would have to define what you mean by connecting them. Like how tight is that connection to that? And I think that's also what using the native software. I think that would be tricky to connect those together. If you were using Companion or something else like that, it might, there's a lot, it's a little bit more abstracted. But I think with the native software is pretty sensitive to a lot of those things. So you'd really have to test it. Yeah, I'm not sure. Next question.
Sarah Doyle in Falls Church, Virginia. Anyone have experience getting their business an ISO 27001 certification? What's the process like, and is it worth it?
Yeah, and so I think that a lot of times these types of certification is, I believe this is really data management. So data management certification, and knowing that you're going to know where all the data is. If you'll know when it's worth it when you're applying for, when you're taking, when you're looking at an application that you have to call for, and you're it'll just say ISO 27001 required. That means that they don't want to think about it; they just want you to do it. Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
Well, this goes back to are those certifications worthwhile? And my opinion has been, and I've expressed it here before, it's not that somebody's going to ask you if you're certified often, but for me at least, going through certification has caused me to go down a path of specific study and testing myself. I get the certification not because anybody cares about it, but because I want to know I went through all the specific modules of the software in order to be tested on it later. And that means I'm going to have a broader scale of knowledge about that thing. I consider it something I do for myself, not something I do for the industry. So that causes me to kind of like certifications if you're in a specific niche like this.
Yeah, and we have been in the past certified for this standard because this is a cyber, resiliency against cyber attacks and a managed framework, secured information, and so on and so forth. And so you have to get certified for these things, and it's just the only way to get the bid. Usually when this specific standard pops up, it means somebody has just said, "Well, I'm going to check this off," and they have to be certified to do this, or we're not going to hire them, and it kind of lets them whittle away a lot of the folks that might be applying for that bid. And so a lot of times, if you want to be part of that, then you need to have those things. And there's a lot of things like that. We had basic insurance that we had to have, and sometimes the insurance to work at a facility was $2 million of loss and $5 million of liability. And when they say that, like they need proof of that kind of insurance to do the event, they're cutting out 99% of the folks that could possibly do that event, because most people don't carry that much insurance. So folks like with PixelCore, we carried that much insurance because we had to do those jobs. We would up our stuff to handle whatever the job required, and then we always had it. And so it was so those kinds of things help you separate. I will say that things like this, if you put that little certification on, it helps separate you from the pack. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael's up next. He says the Simply Live marketing material mentioned compatibility not only with Zixi, but Nimbra Transport. I have no experience with either, but wouldn't Zixi be much less expensive than a Nimbra, given that it runs on existing server infrastructure?
Yeah, the big thing with the Nimbras is that the latency is much lower. So, and they're really designed. The Nimbras don't particularly like to be over the open internet. They can be, but they're so they're designed. If you're an Internet 2, if you've got dedicated fiber, so things like the switch use a lot of Nimbras to make that actually work, and they're really designed as these very, very low latency, highly configurable systems that you may be able to use there. So, and we use them a lot in higher end production to move stuff around. But it's typically the environment that we use the Nimbras are extremely low latency, high quality transport of either 1080 uncompressed, that kind of thing, 4K. We can send hundreds of channels of audio at almost zero latency across the U.S. We're talking less than 50 millisecond kind of transport times to get there. So that's what we typically use them for. So their advantage over Zixi is Zixi tends to need to spool up. So I don't usually expect Zixi to have a latency under 2 seconds. It may be capable of that, but it kind of starts to unwind. Same thing with SRT. Once you go take SRT under a second, you're starting to unwind the advantages that it has. So you're taking away the thing that it has that it can do. But when you start talking about private fiber networks with Nimbras, you're now talking about very low latency. Probably, if you want to think about it in terms of Zoom, about half to a quarter the latency of Zoom. Next question.
Next one comes to us from Douglas Carmichael, and he says, would the ATEM Constellation HD models still have the ATEM gray issue when sending video to Zoom?
Go ahead, Mitchell.
The first to tell you what ATEM gray is, that occasionally when you're using the UVC connection to your computer, the ATEM will freeze up and send a gray screen, very dark gray screen. To answer your specific question, the Constellation, I have not heard about any problems, nor have I heard that the Web Presenter Pro doing the same thing. So it seems to be specific to our minis and such.
Good, Courtney.
Yeah, I don't think the SDIs will have this problem. And if you're using an external encoder to encode to get into Zoom rather than a USB interface directly from the switcher, I think all of this gray issue is a problem with the handshake of the USB interface on the ATEMs. I haven't confirmed that, but that's I'm getting that vibe. So if you're not using the USB interface and you're using an external interface to get into Zoom or an encoder, you may not have that problem.
Yeah, it appears that somewhere between 15 and 40 requests. All right. We are now changing subjects to our second hour, and we have Gary Trenda here from Sound Devices. Hey, Gary, can you hear us okay?
Hey, I hear you great. You hear me okay?
We hear you great. Fantastic.
All right.
We love it when guests come in well prepared. So Gary, tell us a little bit about. We're going to be talking about RF. Tell us a little bit about your background in sound, but specifically in RF management.
Sure. Yeah. I got started in sound 27 years ago now, which seems like quite a long time. I started off as a system tech, setting up speaker systems, traveling around the country doing concert tour work, and I think a lot of guys who ended up in my part of the world started that way. And then I really got into RF when I got a job with Cirque du Soleil. This is back in the early 2000s. And they were building the Ka show at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. And I was the first audio tech that had been hired just to do RF, because there were 216 channels of RF on that show, which in the early 2000s was kind of a crazy number of RF channels.
Right.
So, and that's when I ended up meeting, guys like James Staffo, who owned Professional Wireless Systems, and folks from Shure and Sennheiser and different manufacturers who were supporting the show. And I've kind of been focused on wireless audio things ever since.
And I mean, Cirque du Soleil has got to be one of the hardest wireless systems that I know of.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you're putting wireless packs on performers doing some real acrobatic things. And that show, most of the performers also had some sort of an IFB built into their costume so they could get instructions from stage management. And a lot of it was related to safety issues. So it was really, critical that it was high reliability kind of stuff.
Right. And what are some of the, as you start to do that, what are the biggest challenges that start to crop up when you're dealing with that many mission critical channels?
Yeah, I mean, your band plan is kind of where you start. You understand, back then we had more spectrum to operate in, so it was a little bit easier, but it's still very high channel count, and you're trying to figure out where does everything fit, because you've got, IFB, which is transmit systems, but you've also got microphones on musicians, receive systems, and you want to separate those out by a certain amount. And there are other things like wireless intercom that show that size. We had over 50 people on wireless intercom for every show. And back then, all of those people had to transmit and receive frequency in the UHF band. So band planning all that out, and then figuring out your coverage for the entire theater. Like, where do your antennas need to go? What kind of antenna distribution do you need to have? Like, all of those things are an interesting engineering question when you're building a show.
And you said we had more. You had more spectrum to work with. What can you underline that a little bit about what happened?
Sure. Yeah. So when I started doing RF, and I'm based in the U.S. In the United States, we had from 470 meg to 806 megahertz as kind of our core UHF TV band, which is where we tended to place a lot of these wireless systems, and that shrunk when 4G LTE systems and other things came in 700 meg, you've got folks like Verizon and AT&T, and there's some public safety radio things that happened in 700 meg. So all that went away, and we did 470 to 698. Then there was a sell-off more recently of a lot of 600 megahertz, and so now we're talking 470 to 608 is our core UHF TV band in the US. And so it's significantly less spectrum. And the demands for wireless systems are, I think, as high as they've ever been. So we're really thinking a lot more about, band planning and spectral efficiency types of issues.
And how do you solve that kind of problem?
I mean, you want systems that are more spectrally efficient. You want systems that are more resistant to like intermod products. So when you can place transmitters closer together, digital systems can tend to be more spectrally efficient. And just alternate frequency bands is something we're also talking about. I mean, it's something with the products I support at Sound Devices now. We can tune from 470 to 1525 rather than 470 to 608. And so there are a number of alternate bands above 600 megahertz. And this is true almost worldwide, that there are areas you can put wireless microphones, but most systems are not capable of operating there. So that's a good thing to try and think about, where else can I go if I've got a really crowded show with a really high channel count.
And so you were at Cirque du Soleil, and then after that, where did you go from there?
So after that, I went to a systems integrator. I worked as an engineer designing installed audio systems for a little while, and then got back to wireless, doing some work just as an independent consultant. A lot of my work was for Professional Wireless Systems. It's a company in Orlando, Florida that does a lot of, large scale events. And I did frequency coordination and RF tech work for them for quite a while. And I think that's where a lot of people have gotten to know me from events like the Super Bowl, where I was the RF tech for the halftime show at the Super Bowl. That's a professional wireless show. So I've been doing that. I'll actually be going back this year. It'll be my 7th year doing that.
Well, and what, when you're a frequency coordinator, what does that mean?
So for a large event, so example for like you guys in the Bay Area, the Salesforce.com does this Dreamforce event, right? And they take over essentially all of downtown San Francisco. And so there'll be a team of frequency coordinators for an event like that. I was the lead frequency coordinator for that event for a couple of years. So we would have people assigned to the different venues, and all they're doing is assigning frequencies out to people who want to bring in wireless systems, because you've got a large array of vendors who are using wireless microphones, IFB, comms, two-way radios, like all sorts of different things that require coordination so that that your channel at your breakout session is going to work as well as somebody at a keynote and somebody down the hall with an exhibit booth. Everybody's got essentially their own lane to operate their RF systems in.
And what do you use to manage that? Like, how do you actually, is it just an Excel sheet that says this is what you get, or is it something more complicated?
You need some sort of large database. Working for Professional Wireless Systems, I use Professional Wireless Systems IAS software quite a bit. They make a dedicated piece of software that helps you with that database function for frequency coordination, does the intermod calculations for you, helps you to zone out systems to different areas where in a large coordination like that, what you're thinking about is, how are the systems interacting? Are these transmitters close enough to each other that intermod products might happen? Are they further apart where I just need to make sure they're spaced out? Or are we in completely separate buildings in different part of town where I could reuse those frequencies? And where that becomes important is if you've got, like, let's say a camera crew that's roaming around an entire conference like Dreamforce, they might be out shooting at one of the hotels and then over at one of the keynotes and then at some breakout somewhere, and they want their frequency to work at all of those places. So we need to assign them a frequency that has an open slot in every one of these locations.
Do you have problems with rogue users?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, one of the other functions of the frequency coordinators, they're typically there doing a scan and watching to make sure that all of the frequencies that they see transmitting are ones that we've assigned out, right? And if there's something that we haven't assigned out, then they've got a portable spectrum analyzer and a directional antenna, and they can go out and actually try and track down where this transmission is coming from and find a very surprised person like, who are you? Why are you looking at my wireless gear?
Right, absolutely. Let's go ahead and open it up. Courtney, you have a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to know if the transition to the A20 Nexus, the full digital transmission, the frequency agile, and the fact that these newer transmitters and receivers have to talk back and forth bidirectionally, If that has increased the availability of bandwidth, and since they're a little more frequency agile for true diversity receivers, has that helped out any, or has that make it more complex?
Well, I think the events that I work, the channel counts haven't really gone down, but it makes it easier to coordinate because you've got more places you could put a microphone. And also with the data channel that you mentioned, where you've got control of a transmitter that could be on talent, that's going to give you the ability, if you do see some interference, like one of those rogue transmitters like Alex is asking about, you can refrequency the transmitter while it's on talent and the receiver can follow along. And so you have some better tools for interference avoidance.
Now, a lot of folks, a lot of times we're talking about UHF, but a lot of folks are using these little ones, these little 5 gigahertz and so on and so forth. How do those compare to this, and what are the pluses and minuses of the less expensive ones that a lot of people are using for their little run and guns?
Yeah, so like 2.4 and 5 gig wireless microphone systems.
Yeah.
I think if you're in a less congested environment, particularly an environment where you've got that open spectrum in 2.4 or 5 gig, that can be a good way to go. If you're just connecting to a DSLR, you only need a couple of channels. The larger deployments, you really need the spectrum to do 40 or 50 channels, which really isn't practical with some of those smaller systems. And on those more professional systems, you're going to see a lot of additional tools just for reliability. Like you're going to have receivers that have multiple outputs, redundant power supplies. You're going to have transmitters that are, I'd say, generally speaking, better range and more reliable. So it's just a different tier of equipment, I would say.
Go ahead, Jeffrey.
Do you think that we'd ever have a hybrid system between an RF and a Wi-Fi or a Bluetooth?
Sure. I mean, I think you're seeing that now, like some of the 2.4 gigahertz systems essentially run Bluetooth radios to do their dedicated wireless link. And it's a frequency hopping system to kind of be more tolerant of a congested RF environment. And you might see similar systems moving into the professional space.
And how does DECT kind of fit in between those things?
Yeah, DECT band is interesting. DECT band in Europe actually has a more available spectrum than in the US. So I think I've seen it, gain popularity there. In the US, for the events I do, it's used a lot for intercom systems.
Yeah, free speak.
Free speak or readable arrow or systems like that, where you're able to multiplex users on a single, somewhat wider RF channel. So in the US, the DECT band is 10 megahertz. It's 2 megahertz channels, but depending on the system you have, you could maybe have 10 users multiplexed in each one of those channels. So on what's essentially 5 RF channels, you get 50 users. And other manufacturers make systems that operate wireless microphones there for a lot of speech applications, I would say, more than like the performance systems that maybe require a little bit higher bandwidth. But speech applications, same thing. You can multiplex users in there. It's good spectral efficiency, less frequency coordination that needs to happen. You just need to make sure nobody else is operating in the DECT band nearby.
We had that problem.
It'll work.
Yeah, we had the Shure, the Shure system. I just can't think of the top, the microflexes and free speak, and then in a hotel, somebody else obviously was doing exactly the same thing. So that became
right. Yeah, and you'll find that those systems, I mean, they're aware of each other because there is a DECT standard of how these things interoperate. Because part of the way that standard was written was for like cordless phones, where you think about if you're in an apartment building, you could have multiple DECT cordless phones. And so they see the channels that the different systems are operating on, but at some point you just run out of channels and time slots. And so you start getting interference.
Yeah, we asked Shure what is there ever been a place that the microflexes didn't work, and they were like, yeah, Plantronics don't work at all. Like that was the one company that didn't pan out.
An interesting thing that some of the wireless intercom guys are doing is actually clocking their various DECT intercom systems to the same PTP-V2 master clock to try and sync up those time slots and have minimize the interference between the wireless intercom systems.
What do you think is on the horizon? I mean, obviously you're working on a lot of that at Sound Devices, but what are you focusing on as like this is the next gen of what we're doing for wireless?
I mean, I think you've seen some of the other manufacturers talk about WMAS, the wireless multi-channel systems, where right now in that core UHF TV band, we're able to use 200 kilohertz modulation for the wireless microphone. So each one of your mics has a 200 kilohertz bandwidth to transmit in. We're expecting a change to the FCC rules, and we've already seen rule changes in Europe that are along the same lines, where we'll be able to use like a 6 megahertz wide channel for multiple microphones. So that opens up a lot of room to innovate in what you're able to do with these digital systems.
How far out do you think that is?
I don't know. I mean, I expect to see the rule changes become official this year. So you might start seeing systems from manufacturers, at least in testing phases this year, next year.
That's great. Let's open up to the producers. What first question?
Our first one comes from JJ McKenna in Singapore. And JJ asks, how much has the migration to digital transport for broadcast channels assisted with respect to available RF space?
At least in the United States, it's made it worse, to be honest. I mean, like the DTV channels eat up the entire allocated 6 meg that they have to put out a TV signal, where back in the old days when it was just analog TV, you would have your main carrier, then a chroma subcarrier, and an audio subcarrier. And that audio subcarrier was just like an FM radio transmission. If you had the right radio, you could tune into it. And there was some open space in between there. And now it's just a solid digital transmission. And as we talked about the repack, now that we're only operating in 470 to 608, there are some large markets where there might only be 1 or 2 open TV channels to place wireless mics in. So you might only have 6 or 12 meg of good, clean spectrum to place your systems.
And is the reason we're getting constantly repacked is just because telecommunications have a lot more lobbying money than sound
Yeah,
folks?
I think money's certainly part of it. You know, the last auction where they sold 600 meg spectrum to T-Mobile, among others, that was billions of dollars to purchase that spectrum. And so right now the broadcasters get that spectrum essentially for free. So when the government sees they can sell it for that kind of money, there's a lot of weight there.
I've always felt that they should have added a tax on top of that purchase that has to reimburse everybody who no longer has a transmitter that works. like that, they would pay everybody for an open fund to do that as part of it.
There was a push for that to help at least people buy new wireless systems that are impacted by the rules changes, and they did actually pay some of the broadcasters for the cost in changing because transmit tower equipment's expensive, and getting a tower crew to go change your antenna is expensive. And so they did reimburse some of that, but I don't think we're going to get money for wireless mics anytime soon.
Yeah. Next question.
Carl Marxer in New York is up with this one. I'm a freelancer in New York City with a MixPre 10. Would a spectrum analyzer like the Tiny SA be useful for coordinating frequencies on my Sony Wireless Lav mics?
Sure. I mean, the first thing to do is to see if your receiver that you're using right now has a scan function. Like that's, when I talk to users, the big thing is just like have some visibility of your local RF environment. Your scan function is your place to start because that's a receiver you already own. And then, an inexpensive spectrum analyzer like the Tiny SA that can give you kind of a visual idea of what's in that RF environment that I'm trying to place a transmitter in. What other things are in there? We've talked a lot about television, but it could be other transmitters. It, could be your, I don't know, anything that's in that in like Wi-Fi environment, like we talked about 2.4 gig, what are the other channels that those things are operating on? Just getting a visual idea of what's there is really helpful.
And a Tiny SA is just a small little piece of hardware that just is kind of a graphical interface with an antenna, and it just kind of tells you what's
Tiny
there.
Spectrum Analyzer. It's some inexpensive hardware. You can get them like on Amazon. I think they're less than $100. Mm-hmm. The RF Explorer is another low cost one. If you get into kind of the area that, the sort of shows that I'm doing, people will have equipment from companies like Signal Hound or Tektronix or Keysight that do similar things, but with a much fancier radio, much fancier front end on it. So just a spectrum analyzer that allows you to visually see the frequencies that you're operating in and then the level of the local transmissions. It's the kind of thing you just connect to your antenna and see what's out there in the air.
Next question.
JJ McKenna back from Singapore, and he says, are there particular ranges that are easier to use for audio coordination?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, obviously, it depends on the country you're in, what the legal bandwidth is in your country. Generally speaking, it's just about finding open spectrum. What some people call it white spaces. It's just find an area of the RF spectrum where other transmitters are not operating. Clean, quiet RF spectrum is your friend when you're trying to get a reliable wireless microphone set up.
And so that's really you almost have to have something like the Tiny SA, right, to be able to find those things and be able to visually understand. Okay, this is where I want to go. This is all the other things, because it's not just other people using wireless mics, right? There could be a lot of other things using up that spectrum, and you should be able to see all of that from that tool.
Yeah, have a spectrum analyzer that operates in the same frequency range as your mics do. And as I said, some microphones have a nice spectrum analysis option on it. I mean, we've got a real-time spectrum analyzer on the new Sound Devices Nexus that will give you a really nice look at your RF spectrum. The spectrum managers from other manufacturers are kind of a cool thing. So yeah, just looking at your spectrum and understanding, even if you don't have a spectrum analyzer, knowing what your regulations are, right? I mean, you could go easily do a search for whatever city you're in and see what TV stations are broadcasting there. And you'll at least know that I can't operate on top of the same frequency as a TV station, because that's, hundreds of thousands of watts and I am 10 milliwatts.
Right. The first thing we tell people when they have when they buy a Sennheiser ENG 100 is change just change the frequency, because no one else does.
Yeah, don't use the default frequency, right?
Exactly. Next question.
Ronnie Hofsey in Tromsø, Norway says he's interested in when to use the antenna included with the receiver and when to change it out for a paddle antenna.
Sure. So generally speaking, receivers will come with some sort of a whip antenna, dipole antenna of some type that's usually omnidirectional. And then these paddle or shark fin kind of antennas that are very popular are a directional antenna. The shark fin's a log periodic dipole array. There are helical antennas. There are Yagi antennas, depending on the systems you're using and what frequency band you're operating in. But the big picture idea with that is a directional antenna generally has some amount of gain. So if you're an audio guy, think about it like a microphone, an omni mic versus a cardioid mic. A cardioid mic is good in the direction you point it and not good other areas. These directional antennas are the same way. You'll have, if you can point it at the talent that has the transmitter on, you'll get some gain in that direction. And so that can be helpful for a lot of situations to get some just passive gain from antenna that doesn't have to have active electronics on it. Some of the shark fin antennas do have active electronics. So if you're buying one of those, you want to think about what's the filtering on that, and then what's the amplifying that's happening on that. It plays into your overall gain structure of your RF system, which, again, similar to audio gain, you want to make sure that you've got an appropriate amount of signal coming in, but you don't want to overload, just like you wouldn't want to take your preamp on your mixer and turn it all the way up until it distorts, right?
And in some cases, it's actually better to have the fins a little further away, like not necessarily right. Like I think there's a temptation to put them right on stage or to do that, but they tend to work a little bit better from a distance.
Yeah, it depends on your pattern. I would say a couple of things. Usually there's two fins because we've got a diversity receiver. And so it's easy to separate those fins out enough if they're not mounted right on your piece of equipment. Like you want them to be a wavelength apart, which at the frequencies we're talking about is not that far apart, right? A couple feet sometimes. Space them apart. But then if you want to get a larger coverage area, you might want to put one on stage left and one on stage right, as an example. And if you have an appropriate system where you could put some gain into the further antenna, that might just widen out your coverage range. And yeah, to your question, like thinking about that 90 degree or 80 degree pattern, letting that open up so that you're for sure in the pattern everywhere that you're walking with the transmitter.
Okay, Jeffrey.
As for the passive ones, I know that you have like a 4, a 5 dB, and a 9 dB. Would changing that out actually help, or is just something you don't have to worry about?
Yeah. So passive antennas, for example, an LPDA is going to have around 6 dB of gain. And then if you want more gain, you would go to like a narrower pattern. Like maybe you'd go to a 4-turn helical that might have a 50 degree pattern, but more like 10 dB of gain. So it's the basic physics of it is the narrower the pattern on it, the more gain you have in the direction you're aiming it, but the less sensitive it is other areas. If you've got an antenna that the physical antenna is not changing and they say it's got 4 or 8 or 10 dB of gain, there's probably an amplifier in there that you're switching the gain setting on the amplifier.
Next question.
Comes from our friend Guy Cochran here on the panel from Seattle. For 8 channels, why would you go with the Sound Devices A20 versus using 2 of the Lectrosonics DSR4 receivers?
I mean, I'm lucky I'm the applications engineer here, so I support people who are using the Lectrosonics receivers in our SL2 product with 8 series mixer recorders. And obviously I support our A20 Nexus receiver. So I get to be a little bit of Switzerland about this. Like, they're both excellent products. I think the advantage of having an integrated 8-channel receiver is you get more functionality out of an A20 Nexus than you would out of a slot receiver in an SL2. That's really anybody's slot receiver. There's just more things you can do with it. And it's, got that big color touch screen on it and a real-time spectrum analyzer and spectrum band tuning and all the fun bells and whistles, right?
Yeah. And I think that, I think a lot of times people underestimate the power of an interface. When things are easier, you do them more often. Like, so when they're harder to get to, when they're harder to set, you tend to set and forget or tend to resist making the changes that you need to make because they're just harder to deal with. And when those things are integrated and exposed to the front, in a nice way, you tend to fine tune things a lot more.
Yeah, and something we thought about a lot with the A20 Nexus receiver is also the ability to remote it. We talk to so many people who are setting up and then they want to move from different sets very quickly, and they maybe have a common cart location where they're recording. And so the fact that you can just PoE power it and send Dante audio back to anywhere, just run out a single cable, I think is pretty powerful. And being able to dock and undock it from your mixer recorder is another kind of cool feature.
Next question.
Looks like JJ McKenna again in Singapore, and it looks like this is how much spectrum availability was there in the 5300 ranges back in 2008?
Or was availed, what was lost, I guess, in the...
Oh, okay. Right, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. We're talking about the sell-offs that we talked about for the US.
Yeah, I think we're kind of coming back to that again, but
it's sure.
This is probably asked before we
got it. Yeah. So we went from 470 to 806, and then we lost all of 700 megs. So we went 470 to 698, and then we lost most of 600. There's still a guard band and a duplex gap in 600 that's allowed for use in the US. But other than that, now we're 470 to 608. So we're down to 128 meg or so.
And we say 128 meg, like how many mics do you think, like people kind of put that in their head, like how many mics or how many channels could you put into that range?
128 meg would be a dream for doing an event right now. The problem really is that within that 128 meg is digital television transmissions. And so what we're dealing with in large cities is generally far less than that, like maybe 24 meg or 6.
Right, because there's 128 meg, but each one of those digital transmissions is taking 6 of that, right? That's like a 6 meg slot that's just basically pulled out of it.
That's exactly right. So you start with that 470, like that's in the US, that's TV channel 14. And so TV channel 14 would be broadcasting from 470 to 476. And then TV channel 15 would be, 476 to 482 and on up from there. So you're looking for what channels of those are vacant to start with. That's kind of your basic, I'm coordinating wireless microphones in the UHF TV band thing to ask. And within a 6 meg TV channel, you could potentially space wireless microphones. If you're not concerned with intermod, you could space them every 350 or 400 kilohertz apart. So you can, easily pack 20 microphones into a single vacant TV channel.
Right.
But there's typically a lot of other considerations about what's in the air and what frequency band does your gear operate in and those sorts of things.
Right. Yeah. So, and that's the advantage of having something that covers that whole frequency is that you're not saying, well, I only have this block or I only have this, this little area here.
Yeah. Yeah. When I talk to people about the spectrum band tuning for the Sound Devices products, we're tightly filtering those receivers down to a 24 meg tuning band. But the thing is really finding that 24 meg that is, clean spectrum. And within that 24 meg, you can easily fit, well over 16 channels of wireless mics if that's all vacant RF spectrum.
Right. Next question.
Mickey Makachor in the Philippines says, what is intermodulation and how does it affect RF audio transmission? And how is it calculated?
Oh, that's a great question. So, and this is something people were more concerned about with older analog wireless systems just because they're generally more susceptible to generating intermod products. And there's a lot of, it depends caveats there. But generally speaking, the systems 20 years ago generated more intermods than our current wireless systems. But the software still considers these intermod products that could be generated. I've actually got a slide that I would like to share, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
About intermod. So let's take a look at this, because I think it helps to kind of get a visual look at what's going on. So what we're talking about is, let's just start with something simple. Like I've got 2 body pack transmitters. As these body pack transmitters start getting closer to each other, each transmitter essentially sees the other one. And what you start to see happen is the signal that is transmitting from each gets mixed in within the electronics of the other one. And so they start to create these intermodulation products, which again, audio guy, I kind of like to think of these as sort of like harmonics. So you've got 2 frequencies that are mixing together and generating new frequencies. And so you can see in the slide here, and this is something I blatantly stole from my friends at Shure, they show an 8-foot and a 4-foot separation of these 2 frequencies. And so as you're separated by 8 feet, you can see a weak third order. And the third order is the first intermod product that you're going to see start to come up on the sides there. And then as you get the transmitters closer together, you might see a stronger third order intermod product. And as you get really close, you start to see strong thirds and then maybe fifths. And so it's really these harmonic signals that are generated, and it's based on transmitter spacing. So when you're trying to decide, do I care about intermod or not, the first thing you want to ask yourself is, how close are these transmitters getting to each other? And as I mentioned, the digital systems, because of the nature of the transmitter design, the type of power amplifiers that are used, they tend to generate lower level intermod products if they generate them all, and you tend to have to get them closer together before you start to see these intermod products. So they're less of a concern with digital systems, but they can still happen, particularly third order intermod products, when maybe you've got 2 transmitters that are on the same person, right? Like you've got double miking your principal talent maybe. If you're putting 2 body pack transmitters on talent, try to get them on each hip if you can, separate them out a little bit rather than putting them right next to each other on their belt, because that'll reduce your intermod products. But that's definitely an example of a transmitter where you would want to think about intermod and do an intermod calculation. And when we say do an intermod calculation, essentially what we mean is we're going to avoid the frequencies where these intermod products might fall. And we're not going to assign other microphones there, because it's essentially interference that we're generating that we're then trying to stay away from.
And do you hear the intermod, or is it just something that is going to conflict with other frequencies? You just have to get around them.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, the result of not doing an intermod calculation would be placing another microphone here on that third order intermod product, trying to tune your receiver there and seeing a signal even when your microphone is turned off. So when you're setting up a larger system, we've got this idea of wargaming the system, where we're going to turn all of the microphones on, get audio coming in from all of them, then we're going to go and turn them off one at a time. And as we turn them off individually, we'll look to see if there are any interfering signals that are there underneath the primary carrier signal. And with your digital systems, they've got a Q meter now on them, which is like a quality meter. And the Q meter is exactly the tool for this, where it'll tell you if there is some interfering signal that's on channel, it's on your frequency and interfering with you.
That's great. So next question.
Next question comes from JJ McKenna again in Singapore. If you were in charge of the FCC, what changes would you make to the current regulations to make frequency coordination easier?
Well, yeah, selfishly, I'd obviously allocate dedicated spectrum for wireless mics. Like there was a proposal to have at least one open TV channel per market for wireless systems, and that isn't going to happen now. Separate from just wireless audio, the other thing I would do is, in the US, I would encourage them to do what other countries do and lease the spectrum rather than selling it for billions of dollars. I think long-term, that's going to be better for just our long-term spectrum band planning.
So so that the buyers have to keep on deciding that they want to pay for that bandwidth rather than just owning it and using it. There's a cost to it.
Yeah, that bandwidth is going to become more and more valuable, and it gives you a little more kind of free market economy to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Next question.
Peter Beldeman in Houston wonders if there is a rule of thumb regarding when the receiver system should be closer to the stage versus closer to the mixing position.
Yeah, the actual antennas in the receiver closer to talent is always better. And it allows you to do some things like not use the amplified antennas, which if you don't have to, don't. I mean, passive directional antenna going into your receiver is still one of the more reliable ways to set up a lot of these wireless systems, or even a passive omni antenna if you're close enough. All these other active electronics in the signal path, they work if you need them, but in a lot of cases when you don't, it's just additional complexity, additional like filtering that you have to think about, amplifiers that you have to think about, noise that it's adding into the system. So I would always get my antennas close if I could. And then, there's a lot of good ways to ship digital audio long distances that, doesn't seal any loss.
Yeah, go ahead, Courtney.
Isn't it always worse to separate the antenna from the receiver to get it closer to the talent than it is to actually move the receiver itself closer to the talent because of the loss in the cable between the antenna and the receiver or amplifier?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, when my stagehands would be mad at me a lot of times because I'd bring really big, heavy coaxial cable. If I had to run 150 feet of coax, I'd be running stuff like LMR 400. I remember one year for a long distance in-ear monitor transmit, I brought LMR 600, which that number on the coax really is the size, like it's 0.6 inches of outside diameter. It's a giant piece of cable. But as the cable gets larger, the loss generally goes down. And so for long runs, use big coax, and same thing that it reduces your need for amplification.
A big coax or Ethernet. That's what, like we use Dante. I mean, for most of our wireless and a location, we might be a long way away, but for us, we're kind of, converting that to Dante as fast as we can to get it out of that move. Next question.
JJ McKenna back from Singapore. What's the best practice for antenna placement and polarity? Is this affected by the pattern of the antenna?
Yeah. So the kind of whip antennas we were talking about, or dipole antennas, those, if the antenna is sitting straight up and down, that it's vertically polarized would be what we would call it. Most of those antennas tend to have an omnidirectional pattern around this way, and then they're least sensitive right above and right below, as you'd imagine. So the overall pattern ends up being kind of a toroidal or donut shape to it, omni pattern. So vertical polarization, you'll see people take one antenna and go up and one go sideways, or they'll maybe put them both at 45-degree angles. If they're very close together, I think that makes a difference. If you're already spacing them out on stands, that's less important because your multipath and reflections and other things that are going on are going to be a bigger deal than that specific antenna polarization. Helical antennas have gained popularity because they're circularly polarized rather than like vertically or horizontally polarized. And so that can be a good thing. An example for that is an IEM or IFB transmitter, where if you transmit it with a helical antenna and send out a circularly polarized wave, that can hit the receiver that talent's wearing, which generally has a small whip antenna on it, and you get better match between that helical antenna and the whip antenna on talent, and better performance out of that system is one of the reasons people tend to use helicals on those.
When you talk about that whip, so for a lot of those, the whip, these whips that come off of these transmitters can be longer or shorter. Mm-hmm. How does that affect the frequencies?
Yeah, so you want to have the correct length, and those are all tuned to a particular frequency with a typical whip antenna on a transmitter or receiver pack. It's probably good to within 10% of the frequency that it's tuned to. And so if you know that I've got an antenna that's tuned to 550 megahertz, if you all of a sudden need to change to a system that's operating up in 690 megahertz, let's say if you're in Europe, you would want a different length of antenna. You want to change your antenna out. And that's one of the reasons why those LPDA shark fin antennas or bow tie antennas or some of these things are popular with the receive side of the equipment, because those antennas have a much wider bandwidth than the whip antennas do. And so they can operate, you can make an LPDA antenna that operates from 470 up to, 1.5 gigahertz if you wanted to.
Right. Next question.
Jason Panks in Nashville, Tennessee. Up next, any concerns with RF competition from Wi-Fi or Internet of Things wireless?
Yeah, it kind of depends on your system. I mean, I was working an event some time back where we had a wireless system that was operating in 900 ISM band, which in the Americas is 902 to 928. And there was a RFID system that operated there as well. I've been places where public utility uses 902 to 928 for gas meters. We talked about Wi-Fi mics as well, where you might have Bluetooth systems operating in 2.4 gig, wireless networks operating in 2.4 gig, and then wireless microphones. So as with all of this, it's really just knowing what else is there in that spectrum. And if you have the ability, deciding beforehand if this is the right system to deploy based on what else is going to be operating in that RF spectrum at your venue.
Next question.
Peter Belbin in Houston is back with, when do you tend toward using helical antennas, and what are your main benefits over other antenna types?
Yeah, so we talked about the circular polarization of a helical antenna. So that can be a benefit, particularly IM or IFB transmit. And commonly available helical antennas tend to be a 2-turn or a 4-turn. And it's the same thing we talked about before. A 2-turn helical would be a wider pattern with a little less gain, maybe an 80-degree pattern. And then a 4-turn, and this depends a little bit on frequency, but then a 4-turn helical might be a 50-degree pattern with a higher gain. And so you do that gain calculation of how far away am I trying to pick this thing up. And if you're trying to pick something up at a great distance, it can probably fit into a 50-degree pattern pretty easily. If it's, close in on the stage, you're not too worried about gain, but you want that wider pickup area, maybe a 2-turn helical is the right way to go.
What is the practical limit to right now to wireless transmission? When you think about like the antenna to the transmitter, what are the kind of distances that you say, well,
how far can you go?
How far can it go?
Yeah. I mean, I think most of the events I work, we try to keep it within 100 feet. I mean, I've certainly done systems that will go, 200 to 300 feet with the right antenna setup. And at that point, you really just start thinking about, can I put additional antennas out? Do I need a multi-zone antenna system? So as you walk between various areas, are you always in the coverage of a local zone of antennas? And how do I combine that together to feed a set of receivers? I know, on the Sound Devices side of things, folks in reality TV are very, well-versed in doing this, where they may be operating in a house where they have to set up 3 different zones and have something outside and that sort of thing. So we obviously keep it as close as possible, but you can go hundreds of feet if you need to and design the system right.
And how does that matrix work? When you're moving from one set of receivers to another.
Sure. So you're setting up these zones, and you've got a transition area where hopefully that's someplace where you don't need wireless coverage. And so you want to make sure that as you move between the zones, as you start to drop off in signal level from one set of antennas, you start to pick up on the other one. General rule of thumb on those things is once you've dropped by maybe 15 dB or so, you might want to start thinking about picking up on your next system. And there's usually metering on your receivers that can tell you that.
And is that being done in the receive, or is it being done in where is the decision to switch from one to the other? Is that the mixer, or is that or is it a automated system?
Sure. It depends on the system. The simplest version would just be a passive system where you've got you're either placing the antenna specifically to get that correct transition from one to another in terms of the signal level, or maybe you're inserting some sort of a pad, right? You're literally just turning the RF down until you get the levels matched up to what you want. And then you can passively combine those together. So the receiver may always see 3 sets of antennas, but the levels coming in are such that the level will be strong on one set and weak on the other 2 in that example.
Go ahead, Courtney.
If you're doing camera hops, which a lot of guys do, especially in reality, where you're transmitting back to a receiver that's mounted on the camera itself, and that camera is usually either handheld or in a Steadicam, and that handheld or Steadicam camera will also have a video transmitter on it that's transmitting up in the microwave areas. Mm-hmm. Is it better to have a miniature helical, or is it whips, or are you going to be? Is it a problem being swamped by the video transmitter since you're within a foot of it sometimes? And what are those considerations if you're trying to do a clean camera hop?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think a lot of times you don't have too much choice as far as what kind of antennas you can put on that camera receiver side of things, because it's got to be small, lightweight. So you're generally using a whip or some sort of dipole antenna. You're not going to mount a large shark fin antenna on camera, right? So really what you're trying to do there, I think generally, is pick a system that's well filtered. And so like if I'm using a camera hop that might be operating in 600 megahertz, let's say, and my wireless video transmitter is up in 2.4 or 5 gig, your receiver on the camera for that audio link is going to filter out everything above 700 megahertz very well. And so by the time you get to 2.4 or 5 gig, that should essentially be gone. You've got an RF bandpass filter on the front end of your receiver that should get rid of that. And that problem is actually a bigger deal, I think, for location sound folks with IFB. You see people who put like an IFB transmitter in the bag and have a receiver in the bag. And a lot of those IFB systems are tuning in the same UHF TV range as your mic receives. And so that's one of the things we're trying to address at Sound Devices with these 24 meg, very steep roll-off SAW filters, where as long as you're outside of that 24 meg tuning band, ideally by at least 12 meg, you'll have a very strong amount of attenuation on the IFB transmitter. And so it won't impact the receiver performance.
Even though it's that close, it can kind of swamp the front end just directly, or
Yep. Yeah, and that's
past the SAW filter.
Yeah,
so
for people,
it reduces the sensitivity of the receiver.
Right. For people who aren't RF guys, there's this idea of desense where think about if you and I are trying to have a conversation and then all of a sudden you just turn on the radio and crank the volume all the way up, right? Even if it's not the conversation that we're trying to listen to, if it's close enough and if it's loud enough, it's going to impact our ability to have a conversation. And that's the same thing with these IFB transmitters. If it's a close enough and high power enough signal, it's going to impact that receiver's ability to receive and decode audio.
Next question.
Next one comes to us from Guy Cochran in Seattle, and he's wondering if you're seeing much action in the 941 megahertz band.
Yeah, that's been a very popular place for people to go. It's one of these alternate frequency bands in the United States where 941 to 960, 941.5 to 960 is legal for wireless microphone operation as long as you've got a Part 74 license, which we encourage everybody to get who's operating wireless microphone systems.
What's a Part 74 license?
So FCC Part 74 rules, you can get a license to operate a low power auxiliary station, which is, in fact, I've got a slide for this too, if we want to go back to that to give you a quick overview on Part 74. Here, let me share this. Okay. So you're allowed to operate under Part 15 rules up to 50 milliwatts in UHF TV band. But then if you have a Part 74 license, you're allowed to operate up to 250 milliwatts. And then you've got these other bands that we're listing out. These are all rules for the United States for folks that aren't in the US. But you can see there's a licensed band from 653 to 657. And then we mentioned there's a licensed band that is in 941.5 to 960. And so if you are someone who is a large venue owner operator, motion picture producer, professional sound company, television program producer, you can apply for a license from the FCC to operate these low power auxiliary stations, which are really mics, IFBs, wireless intercoms. And so it's really just filing for a license with the FCC, kind of like if you wanted to get your ham radio operator's license. In fact, it's easier to get than a ham radio license because you don't need to take a test or anything. And you can be licensed to operate wireless mics. So,
and how hard is it to prove that you're a large venue owner or a professional sound company? Is it just something you kind of fill out? They're recommending that, or do they really want to know that you're that?
Yeah. So the licenses that I've helped people file, I think the FCC generally takes your word for it. I mean, you have to sign a affidavit saying that I certify that everything that I'm telling you is accurate. When I applied for my license, I was doing a lot of work for, TV broadcast, a lot of sports. And so, I worked for ABC and ESPN and on there, and they don't question that I'm involved in production of television programs. And professional sound company, as long as you use a lot of channels, anybody doing reality TV using more than 50 channels, right? So that's probably the simplest one to just say, I operate wireless mics and I operate more than 50 on a regular basis. And that qualifies you to apply for this license.
Next question.
Mickey McAchore in the Philippines is back in Manila. Can you discuss the advantages and or disadvantages of RF Venue's Diversity Fin?
So yeah, Diversity Fin is really, I think, it's a good product. It's mainly for convenience. I don't want to set up two antennas, right? I want to set up one antenna and run two pieces of coaxial cable to it. It's got an LPDA directional element to it, and then it's got a dipole element to it. So whichever you hook up, let's say you hook up the LPDA to your A antenna input, and you hook up your dipole to your B antenna input, you're generally going to get more signal on A, and then the B antenna is just there if there happen to be some signal reflections that would cause a dropout on antenna A. Then your antenna B, your omnidirectional dipole, should pick that up, is the idea behind it. So it's just co-locating an LPDA and a dipole antenna is the idea behind that.
Next question.
Alan Cavito in Midlothian, Virginia says, how many RF frequencies are allocated at the Super Bowl? He's heard 2,000.
Yeah, it really depends on what you count, right? Because the folks from the NFL, they call them EFCs, the event frequency coordinators. There's a team of, it's got to be more than 20 of these guys that are at all the different venues, all the different events happening related to Super Bowl, people on field, outside the stadium, they're all over the place. And they're doing what we talked about before in my example of the Dreamforce conference, where they're assigning frequencies to anybody using wireless systems. So they're worried about wireless audio, wireless video, wireless intercom. So yeah, if you count up all of these people and just all of the other signals that they keep track of, every frequency that's there for law enforcement locally and, all the stuff that's in the air, it's definitely thousands of frequencies in their database. The wireless microphone users, my setup that I have for halftime is a small subset of that. Like we've got hundreds, not thousands of frequencies in the stadium, but it's still kind of a mind-boggling number of systems that you're trying to co-locate.
Next question.
Guy Cochran, Seattle, Washington again. What's one of the worst RF hits you've ever seen or heard of in production, and could it have been prevented?
Well, yeah, I think they can always be prevented. I'll be honest and say, like, for the events that I do where you've got technicians that have got a lot of experience and are setting up pretty large scale antenna systems, the biggest failures tend more to be equipment failures rather than frequency failures. Like we've got systems with frequency like redundancies where interference on a single RF channel, a single audio carrier, it's not going to take out your show. But we've talked a lot about digital audio systems. If you lose a Dante audio link to one of your racks of equipment, you can lose a lot of channels in a hurry. And so that tends to be the bigger failures that I have seen is in that. And so something that I didn't think I'd be as well versed in when I started doing this is just all of the networking setup, setting up redundant networks and running fiber optic cable between network switches and integrating all that stuff in. At one point I took a Cisco Computer Network Academy, CCNA class to learn a little bit more about computer networking because I was getting into configuring network systems to build some of these more complicated wireless intercom systems where it's, SMPTE 2110 and AES 67. And there's a lot to setting that up as well beyond just the actual wireless audio carrier aspect of it.
Next question.
Stefan Fischer in Würzburg, Germany says, we've heard that IFB and other body packs may interfere with each other. Wouldn't it then be better to offer both in one device so that the signals are far away from each other by design?
Sure. That's what you saw with the old wireless intercom systems. Like when I started doing this, it was, Telex BTR 800, 825 packs where you'd have a transmit frequency that might be, 480 and a receive frequency that might be 650 or something where they're separated out and they're filtered like we were talking about before. We're just kind of counting on people to do that manually now. I think with the current systems, if you're thinking about, IFB and microphone, the companies that make those systems are a lot of times different companies, or the systems don't tightly integrate together where you'd want to put a single body pack on talent. But I don't know, maybe that changes where you have a headset mic with your in-ear monitors going into a single pack.
We the Shure Microflex has those, has both the little 1/8 inch jack as well as the mic input.
Oh sure, because deck band, right?
Oh, it's so great. Like it's just so great because we just hand someone something, and now we have that all, we have their lab, and then we're able to talk to them, and we're not putting a bunch of packs on trying to figure it out. It's pretty awesome. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael's back. This time he asks, what spectrum needs do wireless video systems like the Teradek Bolt have in comparison to wireless audio systems?
Yeah, wireless video just needs a lot more bandwidth, right? You're sending a ton more ones and zeros to ship an HD video stream, even with some amount of compression across a wireless link, than you are to, send 20 to 20K audio.
Next question.
Mickey Makachor back from the Philippines with antenna diversity, ratio diversity, frequency diversity. What's the real true diversity?
Yeah, depends on who you ask, right? Generally speaking, like if I say true diversity, what I mean by that is that I've got an A antenna and a B antenna, and each one of those antennas has its own radio, and that radio is receiving an RF signal, doing some amount of decode on it, and then deciding which audio signal is better coming off of those two radios. Some of these other systems, what they're doing generally to make them either more compact or maybe lower cost, is they've got a single radio, and then they're switching which antenna between your A and your B antenna goes to it. And there's different ways that you can switch between the antennas, and there are pros and cons to that. But I think that's kind of your core difference is, are you changing the antenna signal into a single radio, or does each antenna get its own radio so that you could, and where do you make the decision on which signal path is higher quality at any given time?
Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, I've always had a question is I'm not sure how it works. I'm not sure you know how it works inside the A20 Nexus. Does it have where it can receive 8 or even 16 different transmitters inside that one small receiver? Mm-hmm. Does it have separate receivers for each antenna, for each frequency, or is it frequency hopping between the different digital transmitters and multiplexing the receivers across all of those transmitters?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's something that I think, at Sound Devices, we're having to do a little bit of education with people on, because it is just a different receiver topology than folks are used to. We're doing it a little bit differently. It's a 24 megahertz wide tuning band. So we're filtering that chunk of RF spectrum, but then at the point where we're down to 24 megahertz, we're actually digitizing that. And so there's an A to D converter that, in other digital wireless systems, your A to D converter may only be converting the 200 kilohertz or so of your single digital transmitter, right? We're digitizing 24 megahertz. And then that digital stream goes into a processor. For us, it's an FPGA processor. And within that FPGA, we're able to do additional filtering and then decode of the signal within the FPGA. So it's sort of like the transition from analog to digital audio, right? Like we're used to saying, oh yeah, I could totally digitize 20 to 20K worth of somebody's voice and then process that later in the digital realm, right? But we haven't typically talked about doing that with wireless microphone systems. And so that's really what we're doing now. So the answer is kind of both. Like we've got that front end and we're digitizing a large chunk of RF, and then we're processing that in the digital domain, and there can be filtering in the digital domain and then decode that happens there of the digital signal. Does that make sense?
So the transmitters are always stuck on whatever's frequency they're assigned to, and they're not frequency hopping while they're transmitting.
Correct. Yeah, that's correct. It's a fixed frequency transmitter, but all of your 8 or even up to 16 transmitters for an A20 Nexus fall within that 24 meg tuning band, so that the FPGA sees all of those signals and can process all of those signals.
So it's just got parallel A to D converters going, or D to A converters going on each of those channels within that spectrum.
The A to D has a 24 meg capture bandwidth, which is just a very different thing. It's more of something you'd see in a software-defined radio more than in a traditional wireless receiver.
Next question.
Stefan Fischer back from Würzburg, Germany, and he says, is an IFB device by Sound Design in sight? If so, what features would this device have to make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, Sound Devices is always working on new products. I mean, we get requests for an IFB or in-ear monitor type system a lot. So, stay tuned. Let's see.
Next question.
Douglas Carmichael is up next. I've heard stories of RF coordinators at large events having to shut down rogue RF users like ENG camera people, for example. Would there be any wireless press box system to distribute one common feed to all users that could mitigate this issue?
I think maybe speaking from my experience as a frequency coordinator, generally, if you're going to a large event, you're probably getting credentialed for the event. And along with your credentials, there's almost always some information about the frequency coordination requirements. So for any of these ENG crews, follow those instructions, reach out to the frequency coordinator, get frequencies assigned ahead of time so you don't run into this problem. But then secondarily, like, always have a wired mic and an XLR cable with you, because if you do show up and you haven't followed these instructions, it is possible that they'll say, I'm sorry, you're not able to use wireless on this event because you didn't follow the frequency coordination requirements.
Or if you think that Secret Service might show up, it's usually useful to have
Right.
wires.
Right. Yeah. And people ask me about this, like, well, what are you gonna do? How are you gonna make me shut down? It's like, I don't really have to worry too much about that. Like, you're credentialed for this event. It's easy to get your credential pulled and get you taken off site to where I don't care what frequency you're using because you're not on my show site anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's what's important there is that one of the things is if it's the first time you've gone to a big event like Dreamforce or like a convention or something, is to ask whoever you're working with at the thing, who is the frequency coordinator? Because I think when we first started, I apologize in advance, when we first did Dreamforce, if we were there at the same years, I didn't know who the frequency coordinator was. I didn't even know that the frequencies were being coordinated. We were working for Salesforce, so we were just kind of like going out and doing our thing, and so so I think we learned to ask,
And I'll say most frequency coordinators are generally pretty nice people and approachable. I would say. I mean, they're really there to make sure everybody's gear works reliably, and so. Yeah. Even for times when I've been at events and found somebody who came in and wasn't aware of the requirement, I'll say, hey, I've got my database right here on my laptop. What frequencies do you need? What gear are you bringing in? If I can assign you a clean frequency, I'll do it. I'm not trying to tell you have to shut down. I'm trying to just give you a reliable frequency to operate on.
Yeah. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael has this one. In many European and Asian countries, digital TV and or radio stations often share a transmitter with their signals being multiplexed into one common stream. If that were introduced in North America, would it make RF coordination for production easier?
I mean, possibly. Spectral efficiency is something we think about for all these systems, but really at the end of the day, it's about finding that open spectrum like we've talked about a couple of times, like what unused spectrum is out there for you to operate your wireless microphones in. And that's going to just depend on your specific geographic location.
Gary, that was a very dense hour.
Yeah, that's great questions.
Yeah, really. I was so excited when you mentioned that. Hey, I'd be open to doing this. I was just like, oh, now we're talking. And I think we may try to drag you on another time somewhere in the future. I hope you're open to coming out.
Yeah, anytime. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, really.
Exceptionally
really
high signal to noise ratio.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Really, really great hour. Amazing. Thanks so much. And thanks to our producers for all the great questions that kept this going. A lot of great questions that kept both the first hour and the second hour going. Thanks to the panelists, of course. We can't do this without you. And thanks to the incredible team on the back end that comes together, the small village that comes together and makes all of this happen every single day, 7 days a week. I really appreciate all the effort that you put into it. All right. Let's go ahead. One thing, 153,000 miles. We did a lot of miles today. We covering between all the question answerers and askers. 153,000 miles, 247,000 kilometers, 1.391 billion bananas for scale. And so it was good. It was a good day. All right. Let's go ahead and jump into After Hours. I need to figure out. I need to get a tiny essay. I have the RF Explorer, but it's kind of old.
I put a link in the regular chat to the tiny essay.
I saved that link. There's a lot of me typing it.
They're not gone yet. I'm shocked.
What's the wavelength of a banana,